Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Completing Access to Broadband program mapping webinar for broadband providers. My name is Crystal Dickerson. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager for the Division of Broadband and Digital Equity. I am joined here today by a slew of my other colleagues who are going to provide a lot of information on mapping that you need ahead of the Completing Access to Broadband program launch. Today, just a few housekeeping items. If you could please use your Q&A function or chat function, if you don't see the Q&A, to submit your questions. We have a lot of content that we are going to provide today, so we may not be able to get to your questions. We will try, but if we don't get to your questions, we would love to see them recorded in the chat. We will be putting out some supplementary information in the coming weeks, and we will definitely take those questions that you submit and look at those as we put out that content. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Angie Bailey, the Director of the Broadband Infrastructure Office.
Good morning. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Happy December 1st. There's so much kind of happening in the state with broadband, and we want to make sure we get this out to you. We know the holidays are quickly approaching. And we appreciate your time. We know that you all as providers are extremely busy, as all of us are in the broadband space. So thanks for your time. So today's session is on mapping in relation to the Completing Access to Broadband program. I want to really thank, so we have a sister office, Center for Geographic Information and Analysis at DIT, that does a lot of our mapping work, and that is led by the mapping work for broadband is led by Ben Shelton. So I want to really thank him for all of his work, and Stephanie Jane Edwards, who is our broadband data and mapping lead in the Broadband Infrastructure Office. They have both been working super hard this year on all this data related to this broadband funding that's out there and these builds that are happening. So they're going to be covering the majority of the topics today. Also, Nate Denny, I want to thank Nate is our Deputy Secretary for his leadership with CAB. So we'll jump in. So if we could go to the second slide, please, Crystal. So there's a lot to cover today. So kind of where we are, we want to provide high level updates on all these topics. And I think it's going to take several iterations, to be honest, for everybody to absorb all these pieces. So right now, this is meant to be high level today. There's a lot that we're still documenting and we need to publish in our updates in our CAB guidance, which should be coming out updated in the next week or two. There's still maps. Some are live, some are still being published. So it's kind of an iterative process. But the topics, so I'll give a quick update on the CAB program overall. We're going to talk about broadband, the new broadband funding map, which is kind of about protected areas. We'll talk about our CAB planning tool and the CAB eligible locations within that tool. The protest process for CAB, how providers will submit data and counties will submit data to us through these new Amazon Web Services folders that we have set up. County prioritization of areas for the CAB program itself, how they're going to kind of delineate areas that they want to have focus on in these procurement bids. How broadband providers will submit data for CAB scopes of work. Again, this is all high level. And then a little bit on CostQuest licenses. So those are all the topics. We'll try to move through quickly, but be thorough. And again, get everything kind of documented and get the CAB guidance updated soon. And this session today is for broadband providers. To be clear, we do have a webinar on Monday for counties. So there may be some intermingling, which is fine. The information is generally the same, but there's some focus. Some items will focus more on with you all as providers, some more with counties. Okay, so if we could go, Crystal, to the CAB program updates. So again, high level on CAB updates, because we mainly want to focus on mapping. We do have for CAB, as you all know, a requirement for a pre-qualification of broadband providers. So we did receive responses to our broadband expansion and access RFP a few months ago. Those awards for those pre-qualified vendors, those decisions have been made. We are working on finalizing the convenience contract to approve those vendors. We would then share the list of eligible providers with the counties and with you all, obviously. So there's some of the topics today that will be just relevant to providers that get pre-qualified and participate in CAB right now. But other providers will be eligible to participate in the protest process, and then also kind of our work that we're doing around identifying any broadband publicly funded areas in the state. So let's see. So I want to make sure I cover kind of what's relevant to who. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we are today sending out a process document that we just finalized. It's called the NCDIT County Collaboration Process. And within that, there's a county commitment form. And so that's being emailed out to the county managers today. And I want to really thank Jeff Brooks on our team for all the work that he's done with the counties on the CAB process up till now. So he is obviously still key in the CAB process, but folding in more people as we get to launch of the program. So that basically what this document says, and we will share it with you too. It kind of outlines a few key steps as we're preparing for the procurement process. So the counties will need to return to us this county commitment form that has their up to amount of what their matching funds for this program and the source of funds. We are developing the county level scope of work document, which is kind of the procurement document essentially that we would post for each county that wants to participate. A key piece of that is the evaluation criteria. So we have that drafted. We're working to finalize everything, and the counties will get to have some input on the evaluation criteria for these the scopes of work or the actual kind of bids that we receive for each county. Right now we have around 30 plus counties that we believe have the funding in place to participate. But I think that sending out this form will help us get a better sense of whether that's changed at all and how much money we really think the counties have to put into these projects. We're also asking the counties within this kind of correspondence going out today, we're kind of explaining their role in prioritizing areas. So we would see, and we'll cover this later on, that whatever locations are eligible as unserved and underserved in a county would be, you would be able to bid on those, but counties are able to say, but we'd really like focus on this area or that area. And so that would be folded into the evaluation process. And then we've also asked counties to identify the up to 2 team members to participate in the evaluation team for each set of bids that come in. So hopefully all that will come in relatively soon. We need to kind of finish some of the mapping processes first, but that's at a high level where we are on the CAB steps right now. And we are planning another webinar on December 18th to focus more on programmatic pieces, and that would be for providers and counties. So that's our update, quick update on the program itself. I do want to highlight, let's see, I have a couple quick things, I'm sorry. Just on timing, CAB right now, we're trying to focus on what we can push out between now and the end of June. So we're trying to identify counties that have funding in this window. What's going to be different, very different about CAB than GREAT is the fact that because this is a bid document, once an award is made, that gets signed and that's final. So it's contracted right away. So with GREAT, what we've experienced is the contracting time has taken a fair amount of time. So that will be very different with CAB. We have to include all this information in the front end of the bid. But I think we'll find that making the awards will be quicker. So that's good. So that's kind of what we're focused on right now is what projects we can get bid and awarded between now and the end of June. If it's possible, there could be legislative changes to the program, so we want to make sure we get out what we can in that window. So that's high level on timing. I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk about protected areas. I just want to say a couple quick things on that. So when we talk about protected areas, those are broadband projects that have received public funding, either federal, state, or local. And so you all may know that in our great legislation, we're required to collect data from providers once a year where they have federally or state funded builds. That legislation was written years back. And so we're kind of following that concept. But what we recognize is that this is going to be a constant because there's so much funding floating around that we were going to have to kind of keep this updated on a continual basis. And so that's what we're working towards. We will be sending out an email, hopefully in the next week, on those kind of protected areas and how to work with you all to make sure that the data that we have is correct. And we also really need data on local builds. So if there's a county that has funded a project, we really need you all to help us get that data so that area can be protected. And the other big piece, and I promise I'll turn it over to Ben, a huge part of this protected area work has been this crosswalking. So taking our prior awards made by the state have been mapped against the address NC data set. And so now because of the new FCC process and data process, we're translating that to the BSLs. For those of you that have great federal contract awards, those will stay contracted with the address NC data that's in your grant award, but we also need to map it in this BSL space. So it's a little bit strange, but that's what we think is the best way to tackle this. So that's just a heads up. All right, thank you. Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Angie. So really, what I'll be covering in my section here is kind of the data and resources and tools that we've put out to help through this CAB process, and primarily for the protected areas here today. If you aren't familiar with NC1MAP, I definitely recommend going to nc1map.gov, and under the data projects at the top, you'll find a broadband initiatives page. Also on the main NC1MAP page, there's a kind of a broadband card lower down that you can get to all the broadband resources. So everything's kind of located on one page for everything you may need. Specifically today, we're kind of highlighting the planning section, which is about halfway down the broadband page, and we've made quite a few updates just recently to this section to kind of gear up for the CAB program and get things updated with the latest FCC broadband data collection data, as well as what we're kind of highlighting today is that NC broadband funding card you see there on the left. In that card, there's two different buttons here. There's a data button and a view button. And both of those links will kind of take you to the same data, but just in different manners. The data button, which I'll show here in a little bit, is kind of a tabular view. You can download, pull the data into your own mapping software packages. And then the view button is kind of an online mapping resource, a dashboard where you can view and see all of this protected area data and gives you a few different download options. So definitely that planning section has been tremendously updated this week, and the CAB planning tool, which Stephanie Jane will cover a little bit, it has been revamped with the latest data and some new resources to give you a different perspective of broadband status in each county. Crystal, if you can go to the next one, please. Here's a view. If you go to that view link in the NC broadband funding card, you'll see this view where you see the data that we're pulling from the FCC's broadband funding map for the federal programs. All of the polygons that you see on this map are coming directly from that map from the FCC. We've pulled those down, symbolized it, and then kind of use those, and I'll show how we use those in crosswalking those kind of polygon area awards into the broadband serviceable location, the CostQuest Fabric data set. And that's what you're seeing on the map here in the points. These are all of the BSLs that we have crosswalked for federal and state programs from all of those older projects that have been awarded. The goal here is so that we go into the new programs, the new funding programs, and we're using those broadband serviceable locations as kind of the baseline for those programs to define project areas. Well, we want to make sure we're not funding something that has already been funded through this older program. So we need to kind of migrate everything into that broadband serviceable location data set so that we are kind of apples to apples, continuing in the same data set going forward, and protecting those locations that have already received that funding. And in this map, you can see and visualize the data and pan around, but you can also see the tables at the bottom. So we have a federally funded program table and a state funded program table. So these are the results of our crosswalk that I'll get into here in a little bit. But in those tables, you can see those highlighted icons there in the red boxes. In that menu, you'll be able to filter the tables based on any of those fields that you're seeing in that table, and export it straight to CSV. So that's one kind of manner, and I'll highlight a couple of different options for downloading these tables, but this is one that you can do straight from the map to get the data pulled down. And what you'll receive is basically what you're seeing in those tables. It'll be a location ID from the broadband serviceable location with the program information for those funding programs. Due to the CostQuest license restrictions, we can't really give out the broadband serviceable location data fully with all the geometry and everything behind it, but we can provide the location ID field that you can then pull down and join to the fabric that you may have if you have a license to map things internally on your end. So this is one manner that you can get to the data, download those tables, and then get those location IDs that we're saying are protected going forward. Next slide, please. Another way is through that data button in the NC Broadband Funding Card. In this data button, you'll kind of see a view of the data in a tabular format, some service information, and be able to filter things. So in the red box there's a little filter button. Just like the table in the map, you can filter everything by program, by grantee, county, anything that we have in these tables you can filter by. And then by going to the next slide here, you'll see that there's also a download button right below the filter button. And if you have those filters set on that previous screen, you want to make sure that you hit the toggle filters, little toggle switch at the top, and that'll allow you to download the filtered version of that table. So if you filtered by a specific county or specific program, then you go to this screen and hit the download. With that toggle filter, you'll only get the subset of the data that you're looking for. And sometimes that speeds up the downloads. These are large data sets. When we migrated things into the BSL data set, the federal table has over 300,000 locations, and the state table has about 150,000. So these are large, point data sets, take a while to download. If there's difficulties with the download in NC1 map, we've also uploaded zip files of these tables to our Amazon Web Service cloud location. And that bottom arrow down there, you'll see that link will automatically just download a zip file straight from our AWS cloud. So it's maybe a little bit more streamlined if you just want the whole data set and not have to worry about filtering. You can just grab that and that'll get you both tables. But you will need a CostQuest license to map this thing locally. And I think Stephanie Jane will give some more information about that and information about an upcoming webinar that we'll be having on those licenses. Next slide, Crystal, please. So to kind of highlight how we've been going about doing this, I have a couple examples here that shows how we've been taking these past grant awards and trying to crosswalk it into the CostQuest location data set. It's not a very clean process in many instances. Those data sets are different for different purposes. And for the past grant rounds, the great grants round 1 and 2 in 2018, 2019, many of those projects we've built out. We have final builds that we've validated from the providers in those projects. So in those instances, we were able to take those final builds, the actual location data that was submitted to us, using our statewide parcel data set. CGIA, we kind of ingest parcels from all 100 counties in North Carolina, and we kind of use a transformer to get them in a standardized statewide data set. So using that data set, we're able to intersect these final build locations with the corresponding parcels, using those parcels that are selected to then select the broadband serviceable locations that fall within those parcels. In many cases, you'll see the green polygons in this screenshot are kind of a 1-to-1 match. Those are the clean ones where we have a final build location that was submitted and we have a broadband serviceable location that was submitted or selected on that same parcel. So we're able to say, okay, this BSL is funded through this final build. In many other instances, like in the purple or in some of the next screenshots, you'll see some orange and different color coding where we're seeing that there's a difference. There's maybe a few more broadband serviceable locations on that parcel than there were final builds, or if there were less BSLs than there were builds. Then we kind of have to go and drill down a little bit and validate what's going on at that location level. And then there's also the red parcels where we have final builds that were submitted to us, but there is no fabric location. For this purpose, there's nothing to protect there, so it's not a tremendous concern, but it is allowing us to go into those areas, look and see if we need to submit challenges to the FCC fabric to improve that data set going forward. So this is kind of how we've done our crosswalk for those previous builds that we've received. If you go to the next slide. In any instance in those early rounds of great grants that we do not have final builds for, we're still working with the providers to finalize the builds in those areas. What we do is we go back to the award data. And in this case, it was a census block that was awarded in this area. And we just kind of use that census block to select all of the BSLs in that area, and we protect the entire area. The final builds, when they do finally come in from the provider and we validate them, it may only be a subset of those BSLs. So then at that point, we will then select only those corresponding BSLs that need to be protected and then release the remaining ones in that census block out for funding. But for now, for this purpose, we are just protecting that entire area in the award. Next slide. So in our more recent rounds of GREAT and the American Rescue Plan Act funded GREAT grant in the past couple of years, we've really relied on addresses coming from our Next Gen 911 program in the state. We grab those addresses and fold them into a product that's called Address NC. You can also find that on NC1 map if you're interested. Address NC is kind of coming from the authoritative county providers. We transform it and bring it into the statewide product, and then we used it to define project areas in these more recent GREAT grant rounds. In that case, if we don't have final builds for those yet, we are doing kind of the same process. We're using the addresses, we're selecting the parcels that intersect those addresses, and then we're analyzing to see which BSLs fall within those same parcels. So then we can protect those BSLs from future funding based on that parcel selection. So in this scenario, this is a clean, crosswalk. You see the green polygons where there's one BSL, which is the pink triangle, to one award location from the Address NC dataset. And in this instance, it also falls on the same building within the parcel, which is really what we're looking for and really makes it a clean one-to-one match. If you go to the next slide, please, Crystal. But, these data sets were created for different purposes. Next Gen 911 data set has its purpose. The BSLs are broadband serviceable locations, so you're not always going to get this one-to-one match. It's important to note that as we're crosswalking this into the BSLs to protect these locations from future funding, the contract is still the contract and the data still is remaining in Address NC going forward. That won't change as we're going through and validating builds. It's just important now that we're going into future funding programs that are using that broadband serviceable location data that we protect these locations and understand where funding has already gone compared to where the future projects may come in. So in this instance, you'll see the green polygons are pretty clean. The one on the left there, you'll see though, the points are on two different buildings and two different structures on that same parcel, but that BSL is still protected for future funding. We think it's safe to say that even though it's on a different building, that location is still receiving service through that program. But then there's instances like the orange parcel here that there are two funding award locations through the Address NC dataset, but there's only one broadband serviceable location on that top building. And in that instance, we need to analyze it and see if we need to make a challenge there to the fabric. Even if we don't, we need to protect all the BSLs on that parcel so that, going forward, that parcel is not funded again. And then there's the red parcel at the bottom where there was an award location, but there are no fabric locations. So we're still tracking those in address NC for the projects going forward, but for the future programs, we need to monitor that to see if the next version of the fabric comes in with a different location that we need to protect. Next slide, please. And then the federal awards are a little more straightforward. They all come in census blocks or polygons, and we just use those census blocks or polygons that we pull down from the FCC funding maps, and then intersect those with the fabrics locations and put those into the table to protect going forward. And these are kind of some of the ones that we're definitely going to be talking with you all to kind of confirm that everything within these polygons needs to be protected. Maybe the project area was defined as a census block, but really it's kind of more specific than that, but the data is just not public to us. Those are the instances that we definitely need feedback to see if we need to be a little bit more narrow in our scope of what we're protecting. And all of this is done through the version 3 of the FCC broadband data collection. So the fabric locations were released back in July, and the availability data that we're using for all of our program going through this CAB round is based on the data that was just released last month in November. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Jane. She's going to get into a little bit more of the weeds and the details of the program.
Thanks, Ben. And this is sort of a follow-on to the cool new funding map that Ben just showed everyone. So in that funding map, there's information that's downloadable about protected areas. And that's the first point in the CAB program that we're seeking input on from the internet service provider community. If there are any corrections that need to be made based on anything that you see as discrepancies between your records and the results of our crosswalking locations into this broadband serviceable location fabric, feel free to submit some information on that, as well as any, we have data on federally funded protected areas and state level funded protected areas, but we could use input on any locally funded project areas that need to be protected from duplicate funding. And lastly, any locations that might be inside a known protected area, but is outside the scope of the contract or agreement for that program that protects the area, then it would help for us to be made aware of that as well. So we're going to try to streamline the ways that you can submit that input using CSV files with the broadband serviceable location IDs, and some additional information and supporting documentation on those examples, or if there are other cases where that we haven't mentioned here, feel free to reach out to us. And we'll be supplying a way that Angie mentioned earlier with Amazon Web Services that the data can be submitted to us online securely through upload in your browser. I'll explain a little bit more about the tool we're using for that in a minute. And we'll try to provide a template and some instructions that will help make this process more user-friendly. If we could go to the next slide. This is our kind of a snapshot of our CAB planning tool that Ben mentioned that's also available from our broadband page on NC1 Map. And this is where you can see also some of the, well, all of the funding that we're aware of that protects areas in kind of a simplified symbology, our great grant locations, and the availability across the state. This is where in our program, we'll soon be adding a layer of all the eligible locations that can then be downloaded from the map. That is being finalized, and we should have it up soon. And that will be at that BSL location level. There's also, as you can see in the top right, a filter where you can select a specific county of interest. And then once you do that, or you zoom in manually, additional layers will come up into the CAB planning tool that may be useful for brainstorming and strategizing for internet providers, as well as the counties that are participating in CAB. If you could go to the next slide, I've got a little screen capture of what that can look like as you zoom into the county. This is Burke County, and you can kind of see how selecting by county gets you some additional options there on the right, where you can filter by individual carrier footprint. And you also can kind of see how those hexagons are working. This is the hex bin layer where we're aggregating information about broadband availability from the FCC's broadband data collection map. And so these hex bins represent in deeper shades of pink and deeper shades of blue, higher counts and percentages of respectively of the unserved locations within each hexagon. But we'll also be aggregating information about the eligibility and scopes of work for CAB to these level 8 hex bins. And so it'll kind of look like this and help us communicate this information to the public and to other, non-licensed entities, coordinating back and forth about the projects that we all undertake in the counties. This is also the map where once the eligible locations are added, there will be a protest process, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then further along in the process, there'll be the county designed scopes of work, which we'll also talk a little bit more about. And you will find all of that information being added and updated here in this map. And we'll be also making efforts to update the other layers of information. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to cover in the program, as we're coordinating on all of these data sets, there'll be data modifications that we're making to the baseline eligibility layer. So that layer is going to start out with all of the latest information on unserved and underserved BSLs locations across the state. And then we're staying consistent with modifications that were made under this same funder, U.S. Treasury, for rounds of Great Grant. And so you'll see fiber to the home, cable, reported. We'll display those based on the performance, reliability, and speed thresholds that are that you're familiar with. Under this program, DSL technologies, locations that only have DSL technology will still be considered unserved, handled that way in the data, remaining consistent with our previous rounds under Great Grant. And then unlicensed fixed wireless, which is also consistent under ARPA with Great Grant. Those are still handled as unserved if that is the only technology available. And then for licensed fixed wireless, it breaks down into a couple of subsets where the location, if it only has licensed fixed wireless over a primarily mobile network, will be handled as unserved, while locations over traditionally what we traditionally understand to be a licensed fixed wireless network with no data caps and not the same dynamicism of availability that is being introduced over the mobile networks, that will be underserved, just to still allow for additional funding under this round of CAB. And then lastly, the new technology code 72 license by rule, which is primarily general access authority, CBRS, will be unserved if that's the only technology reported for that location. And that'll help us to be more inclusive in the numbers of locations that can still be eligible for additional funding under this round of CAB. Next slide. And I think Angie wanted to jump in and cover a little bit about the protest process that will happen once you have a chance to review the eligible locations that we will then add to the CAB planning tool using those data modifications and the data about protected areas.
Yeah, thank you. So the FCC came out with a new data release. I believe it was the week before last. And so Ben has been working with that data to get the eligible locations mapped and adding in these data modifications. Ben, did you want to add anything on eligible locations before I jump into the protest?
No, I think Stephanie Jane covered it, except that we're hopeful to have it ready, by mid-month. I'm hopeful sooner. Just kind of depends on how quickly we can validate the results of what we got from the latest FCC data.
Unfortunately, Ben also works with ortho imagery for the state, so he has some other. We're trying to get him just to want to do broadband, but it actually is it's a good compliment. So he's working with that data. The eligible locations for CAB will be published on the CAB planning tool, as Stephanie Jane mentioned, and then we'll be able to launch into the protest process. So the CAB legislation points a bit to the great legislation in some cases, but we are introducing a two-step protest process for CAB. Been talking with providers over the past year or two. We've kind of gotten the sense that would be preferable to all of us. So we will publish the eligible locations across the state and have a window where broadband providers can submit protests to us on this statewide map. To try to kind of save time and have the most accurate map possible on the front end. But then we also, based on the CAB legislation, will have another window, because with CAB, it's not one funding round like GREAT. It's each county is going to have its own funding. Each county that wants to participate is going to have its own funding round. So, we don't think all 100 counties have funding to participate, but it could potentially be 100 separate funding rounds. Again, I don't think it will be, but so we need a way to make sure the data gets refreshed. So when we get to, County X and we're ready to do that bid, that county has turned in all the information that we need. We will have a short, I believe the legislation says 10-day window where you all will be able to protest those eligible locations before that county bid is released, or maybe simultaneously, probably right before. So that's the idea. And again, it's based on if a location is showing as unserved that you believe to be served. So Stephanie Jane, do you want to talk through the other bullets? Let me just add, I'm sorry, really quickly before she talks about how the data will be submitted. What's very different than when we had our great protest round in years past, is that of course now we switched to the new broadband data collection system with the FCC. We're working with the specific broadband serviceable locations. Each individual location has data that you all have submitted to the FCC on that exact point. So we don't expect a lot of protests like in years past. I mean, our hope is that this data is accurate. We would think that maybe the changes would be if there's been a build out since the last FCC data that was submitted to them, but we're thinking it will be fairly different than past years. So yeah. Stephanie Jane, do you mind talking through the submission?
Yeah, absolutely. So this will also be something we're hoping to streamline and make convenient in a format similar to other types of input that we're inviting from providers through the process. And so we're thinking of uploading CSV files with those broadband serviceable location IDs, some additional fields describing the protest, the correction that the protest is suggesting to be made, and the referencing the supporting documentation that would also be shared that explains why the protest is being made. And we'll provide CSV templates for these purposes. And if you excuse me, are submitting a challenge, we'll be outlining examples for cases that warrant a protest, such as, build out that happened more recently than the most recent available FCC data, or if there were any errors or omissions you feel that were introduced in our crosswalk process, or that kind of thing. But note under this program that the protests don't include planned service, but is specific to service that is available and lit and serving end users today, as of today, or as of the protest date. If you go to the next slide, I can explain a little bit more about how to get information like that to us, how to send in the CSV files and supporting documentation. So we have set up some secure cloud-based Amazon Web Services storage buckets. And within each of those buckets, there's a private folder for each of your organizations. And there's no longer a need to check with Brett on this. On that third bullet, we've got a shared resources folder that's going to be available to each of you with templates and instruction documents and that kind of thing. So that should be helpful. And what we would ask you to do, though, is help us by identifying the correct data person at your organization that we can be sent their name, email, and phone number to broadbandmapping@nc.gov. You'll see this email address on the last slide of our presentation as well. And maybe we can put it in the chat. But if you can alert us to the correct data contact at your organization, then we will issue that person credentials for logging in securely to your private folder for uploading these data sets. And if you move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about county prioritization. However, before I do, there was one other thing. I just wanted to say that those cloud buckets and the Amazon Web Services folders will be multi-purpose, and so you can use them for all the different points along which your input is valuable into this process. So this county prioritization is a key part of the CAB program, and that's another point at which you can provide input into the process, and you'll be able to review the scopes of work that are, in this case, designed by counties in partnership with the Broadband Infrastructure Office. So I've got sort of a sample image here. This isn't really a scope of work by a county, but it gives you an idea of what such a scope of work could look like on the CAB planning tool. Right now, this is just showing one of the tabs where we show some fiber availability. But if you apply your imagination, you could imagine that Chowan County here may have prioritized something. It could be along a waterway or along a certain roadway, or in this case, it's clustered in a southwest quadrant of the county that leadership and constituents may have communicated is priority because it's underserved, or it has lower educational attainment or issues with employment, or there could even be anchor institutions that the county leadership identifies as critical for gaining connectivity to. So we're attempting to capture that input and display it, communicate it in these hexagon layers, so that we can identify where community-centric priorities lie that would be especially impactful to gain high-level connectivity to in the CAB program. So this county input will define the scopes of work that we then add into the CAB planning tool that you see on NC1 map. And then at that point, there'll be a downloadable CSV file that indicates those eligible, there's going to be eligible, unserved, and unfunded locations across the county, but we'll also be indicating which of those broadband serviceable locations is in that prioritized area. And then we'll be displaying it publicly at these hexagon levels so that we're not breaching the proprietary nature of the BSL individual location data. But that will be available to you as fellow licensees. We'll talk a little bit more about the licenses, and that will be at the level 8H3 hexagons that you may be familiar with already from the FCC's broadband data collection map. And those hexagon ID numbers are already available in the downloads from that federal map and some other federal sources. If you go to the next slide, we'll also talk a little bit about the data files that you would send. That would be also pretty familiar. And I wanted to point out that the hexagon layer is being made available for download. So you will have that with your internal mapping for reference. This will be, I think, the fourth point is time in the timeline for CAB where you'll have an opportunity to give input, and this will be the actual responses to the scope of these prioritized project areas. Essentially think of it like the grant application, but it's not, it's a procurement, right? So this will be a CSV file that you can send to us through the online Amazon Web folders. And as you're planning these projects and responses to the scopes of work, keep in mind that it will be advantageous if you can reach as many of the eligible BSLs or broadband serviceable locations within of course, the county prioritized areas, parts of the county, if there are identified priority zones, but then also advantageous to keep an eye to reaching as many of the unserved and eligible locations across as many given hexagons as possible. So take a look at that. It's helpful. We are still finalizing our evaluation criteria for these proposals, but we are going to have an eye towards proposals that address the scope of work identified by the county and that don't leave kind of the Swiss cheese effect within these level 8 hexagons or across an area. So there will be advantages to reaching all of those locations. If we go to the next slide, this is just, I wanted to invite you all to what I would think of as the very next step in getting more information and getting engaged in the CAB program process. excuse me one second. So next week on Thursday, December 7th, we're going to have a follow-up webinar to this webinar in partnership with CostQuest Associates, who's going to present about the no-cost licenses that are available for this federally funded work. This is necessary on top of the Tier 2 licenses that you probably already executed a ways back for the purposes of improving the FCC map, right? Those are essentially like the broadband data collection program licenses. And then for allowing uses beyond improving the FCC's map, you'll want to work with CostQuest to get a Tier D license for the internet service providers. We'll also be instructing counties on how they can acquire the no-cost Tier E licenses on this program. And the steps are pretty much the same. So we're combining audiences for next week's presentation. And the purpose of the license either way is just to expand the allowable uses of that broadband serviceable location fabric, or really like the CostQuest address level data. For ARPA funded work going forward into BEAD in the future and other federally funded work. So this presentation will cover the steps you can take to obtain the Tier D licenses if you haven't already. I know some of you had, and our office is getting updates on and who has obtained the license for this over time. And it will also cover how the license data can be used once you have the license for this program. And I believe we're also going to try to leave some time for questions if you have any. So I appreciate it. We're almost finished with what we wanted to share with you. But Angie has some additional next steps beyond next week's webinar that we could go over with you.
Thank you, Stephanie Jane. Yeah, I want to really stress, so providers, my understanding is that the kind of normal license, you have access to BSLs in your own footprint. But if you want to have access to BSLs outside of your footprint, which would mean participating in the protest process, we think that's really important. So hopefully you all can attend that session. So I'm going to go over this slide in a second. I know there's a lot of information. We are recording this, so hopefully you can share this session with your whoever does mapping within your company, and we will offer some more follow-up sessions. Especially our great grantees, we really want to make sure that you all understand the crosswalking and that we're on the same page with you about how your project translates in BSLs, and that BSL data is what we will submit to U.S. Treasury for these ARPA-funded great projects. So just be aware of that. That is a requirement that they have asked for. The other quick thing on protected areas is that we do have a handful of great grant awards that are still contingent. And so we don't love protecting the areas that are not full contracted grant agreement awards yet, but we are getting close. So we need to move forward. So we have a handful of projects that are still contingent awards, just as a heads up. So next steps, we will be updating the CAB program guidance to reflect what we've talked about today. So hopefully that will be done next week. It may move into the week after, but we're shooting for next week. We will be sending out a distribution, an email to broadband providers on this funded area discussion, hopefully next week, and that would be pointing people to this broadband funding map that Ben has gone over and how to submit data to us on kind of verification of those areas. We are, as mentioned, working to finalize the CAB eligible locations map. And so once we have that timing, we will open up the statewide protest process, and we'll be posting that information on our website. The CAB webinar on programmatic updates will be December 18th. That should be 9:30 to 10:30 in the morning, but we will get information out on that. And if you have questions on mapping, so our kind of general mapping email address is broadbandmapping@nc.gov. Our program email for CAB is cabprogram@nc.gov. So we're trying to move to these kind of standardized email addresses because we've got multiple people on our teams working with all these projects. So that's what we wanted to share with you all. Again, I know it's a lot. We appreciate your time. We can take a few quick questions. Let's see. Crystal, do you want me to just kind of jump in?
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks.
So the timeline for CAB applications, so we need to kind of get all this mapping work in place first. Our hope is that we would start county bids. We'll start working with counties on their specific scopes of work in January. So maybe by late January, we're still getting the exact timeline, but that, and part of it will depend on, we need information back from each county too. So as a county, we know that there's a certain set that seem ready, but the exact timing will depend on how quickly these counties get the specific pieces back to us. And then they would be posted on an individual basis as they're ready. So that's generally timing. I think so. Alan has a question on CBRS. Stephanie Jane, could you talk just quickly on the difference between the PALS and the GAA licenses? I know we only have a couple minutes.
Okay, yes. And so originally under FCC guidance, the PALS, priority PALS licenses are considered a part of the licensed fixed wireless technology, and the general access authority, the lightly licensed CBRS, is now grouped. It was originally grouped in with unlicensed wireless, and is now also has the option to be grouped in with the licensed by rule code 72, and is still subject to some of the same deprioritization and interference as unlicensed wireless. If the CBRS has a PALS license, it is still reported at high speeds and considered underserved, not unserved. Correct, Alan, that is right. In this round of the CAB program, but moving forward, that will change in the future, and that will then under BEAD be handled differently. And then I think part 2 of the question was about cable connection.
So I think that
served.
I think the question is, so if a technology had an upload of just 10 down, 10 up, how would we treat that?
Right. Yes, that is not considered served. That would also be considered underserved because of the emphasis that our funder has at the federal level on 100 symmetrical, scalable up to 100 symmetrical, but minimum 200, 100 down, 20 megabits per second up. So,
and if you all have
the framework
I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
If you all have other questions on data modifications, we'd be happy to meet with you, individually as companies. We do get questions on that, of course. I think we're pretty much out of time. We would still really encourage you all to send questions. It really helps us understand what y'all are struggling with, what you need more information on. So I think they can still send questions after the chat closes. I'm not sure. Otherwise, you could just email them to us.
Yes, please send emails to broadbandmapping@nc.gov, or if they're CAB specific, to cabprogram@nc.gov. We will be, as Angie mentioned, recording this webinar. It has been recorded. We'll be downloading it and placing it at ncbroadband.gov/cab. For anyone who joined late, it will be there, or if you want to share it with some colleagues. Thank you so much for coming today. I think that concludes our presentation. Thank you all.